Hello and welcome to the IEA's book club, Debating Democracy. My name is Bartha and I'm the director of EPICENTER, which is a network of 9 leading classical liberal think tanks from all across Europe, which of course includes the IEA. And I'm tremendously excited about today because I have the pleasure to welcome 2 of my favorite authors, Dr. Eamonn Butler and Professor Garett Jones, to discuss and debate one of the biggest contemporary challenges of political philosophy, namely the merits and the problems of democracy. But before we start with the exciting part, let's get over with some of the less exciting housekeeping rules. I'm obliged to warn you that today's discussion will be recorded and simultaneously live streamed on our IEA YouTube channel. So all guests watching on Zoom will be on mute throughout the discussion, but we do count on your active participation through other means. First, our guests will be giving their opening remarks, each of them for about 7 to 8 minutes. Then I will challenge them, and I assume they will challenge each other on some of the key points mentioned in their introductory statements. And then it's going to be over to you, the audience, as the last half an hour will be dominated by your questions on Zoom. So if you're on the Zoom side of the debate, if you wish to ask a question, please select the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type out your question either as yourself or anonymously. And during the Q&A session, I will be the one reading out some of these questions for guest speakers to address. If you're rather shy, then you have the ability to upvote the questions that you would like to see answered. And if we have a great number of questions, then we will proceed in a democratic manner, and I will be looking to address the ones that get the most votes. Unless, of course, Garett will convince me that democracy is a failed idea and I should rule with technocrats' expertise, in which case your votes will not matter. Last but not least, feel free to utilize the chat function as well, which enables you to send messages, articles, or chat with other attendees. Feel free to say hello to us, but please do not ask questions in the chat function. Post all your questions in the Q&A function. Today, we will not be taking questions from YouTube as we're giving priority to our book club members and viewers on Zoom, but feel free to use the YouTube chat to engage with each other and with us, share links or thoughts on the event. So with the housekeeping rules out of the way, now let's move on to the exciting part. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Eamonn Butler to the conversation. Eamonn is the co-founder and director of the Adam Smith Institute, which is rated as one of the world's leading policy think tanks. And Eamonn is really one of the most productive think tankers I know. He's the author of at least 10 IEA primers that have been translated into numerous languages. I think I've seen over 50 translated and republished versions of his primers. And I'm sure after today's book launch, there will be many, many more to come. And it's also fantastic to have Professor Garrett Jones with us today, who's joining us from the United States. Garrett is an associate professor of economics and a professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And he's the author of one of my favorite books of 2020, titled 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust the Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less. And I wasn't the only big fan of his book. The economist Tyler Cowen and many other prominent reviewers also gave their ringing endorsement. So gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have both of you with us today. Some of your audience might not be greatly familiar with your work yet, so they might be expecting a brutal showdown between the two of you. Eamonn, for you to argue for majority and democracy and rule by the people and for the people. And Garrett, for you to argue for a European Commission style technocracy or Singaporean style ruled by philosopher kings. I'm sure your arguments will be a bit more refined than that, but I would still ask both of you to provide your opening statements with a different focus. So let's start with Eamonn, because your book has just been launched today, titled Democracy, an Introduction. I'm sure that throughout the writing process of your book, there are many things that you've encountered when it comes to liberal democracy and why liberal democracies are usually superior systems to all other forms of government. So to put the question bluntly, what is your 7-minute endorsement of liberal democracy?
Well, thanks for that, Adam, and thank you to the IEA for actually producing the book. I had great fun writing it. My purpose in writing it really was to explain democracy and democratic institutions to people who don't have it, who live in countries where they don't have democracy, they don't understand democracy. So that was part of my feeling. And then also to explain it to people who do have democracy, who do live in democratic countries, and get them to understand its limits. Because, you know, the word democracy has changed its meaning in the last few years. People think about Athens and decisions were made by the whole population. That's not how it works today. When we talk about democracy today, we're talking about representative government, where you have elections and you represent members of parliament or members of Congress, and they take the decisions on your behalf. And of course, often countries claim to be democratic when they aren't, and nearly every country you can think of that's got the word democratic in its official title is not democratic at all. And I think even in relatively democratic countries, people don't really understand what democracy means. It doesn't mean that the majority can do what it wants and just rob everybody else, rob the minority, torture people it doesn't like, exile people it doesn't like. So you realize very early on that there are higher values that have to be served ahead of democracy. Democracy is there to serve our values and our freedoms, and not to override them. It's not legitimate for the majority simply to override the values and the freedoms of the minority. And of course, the early Greek writers, Aristotle and Plato and so on, Aristotle certainly understood this. So did the US founders, that there were limits to democracy. And they didn't want democracy. They wanted, in the United States, a republic where people would elect representatives to take the decisions, and where there would be institutions like the Constitution to limit the power of their leaders, so that not even an overwhelming majority could violate the rights of ordinary citizens. And you need a constitution to do that, or you need certainly a very deep culture that protects people's rights and freedoms. And you need an impartial judiciary. And these are all things which in some countries that call themselves democratic, they don't really have. So I think that democracy is, and to answer your question, I think that democracy is an essential element of a free society. It protects us from arbitrary laws made by the whim of dictators. It respects private property, unlike dictators who can just rob anybody they like. And I think it serves the liberal idea of minimizing coercion, because you take decisions by consensus rather than have them enforced on people. And I think that democracy is built also on the other liberal principle, the idea of a spontaneous order. And the whole public have a role in making laws and decisions through a wide franchise. I think also it respects freedom because decisions are made on the basis of political equality. We all count as equal members of society. And it requires free speech. It's another liberal value which it entrenches, that you have to be able to discuss the issues that you're voting on. So I think for all these reasons, I think democracy and free societies go together. But of course, the institutions that you set up to safeguard all these things have to be stable and trusted. And democracy must be genuinely representative. It can't just be the rule of the majority. It has to reflect the whole population. And it has to be limited in scope and power so that it doesn't ride roughshod over people's rights. It's questionable how many of those things actually apply, even in countries that call themselves, and we regard as, democracies today. Many countries, of course, come close to the ideal, and many other countries aspire to be considered as real democracies, even though they're not. So everybody wants to be a democracy and do the right thing, I think. And that's, I think, the spread of democracy has helped countries in general to be mindful of these liberal values. I think it's helped societies to be better governed, more open, more peaceful, to protect individual rights. They're much better protected in democracies than in other places. Partly, of course, because people are free, they can migrate. And if you don't like your system of government, you can go to another one. So liberal democracy, as well as the mixed economy, I suppose, a mixed economy and the liberal democracy, is a remarkably stable set of institutions. They seem to go on without getting themselves into a big pickle, like many dictatorships do from time to time. And to me, the greatest danger in democracy is that we get too dewy-eyed about it, and that we allow it to politicize every part of our life because we think democracy is a good thing, so it should decide everything. And I think probably in the West, we don't even realize, we take our rights and liberties so as being given, and we don't even realize that we're eroding them. So I think democracy is great. I think it needs to be limited in scope and it needs to be limited in power. To those who haven't got democracy, I would give it 3 cheers. To those of us who do, well, I think I'd probably give it 1 cheer, but I'd give it 1 cheer.
It's still a cheer. That's good to hear. And I'm sure that in the audience, I'm not the only one who's often frustrated about the outcomes of democratic decisions. But occasionally, it's a very good reminder to hear that liberal democracies are still a pretty decent system of self-governance, especially if we compare it globally. But now I would like to turn to Garett and hear the opposing motion, basically about the limits and shortcomings of democratic decision-making processes. You outlined that quite well in your book. So Garett, over to you.
Well, first off, I want to say that I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm especially grateful to be on a panel with Mr. Butler. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I agree with what you said in particular, that representative democracy is an ideal that essentially every nation in the world should strive for. The question of what kind of representative democracy, though, how do we find out what kind of representative democracy we want? One way to do it is by looking at what would happen if we had even more democracy, because no country in the world today has the maximum level of possible democracy. And here I'm defining democracy not as a government that enforces human rights, but as a government where there is mass participation of the citizens in the government to the greatest extent possible. And obviously, in the world of smartphones and social media and high-tech secured banking, we could obviously have much more citizen participation in government than we have right now. We could be running most of our government decisions on plebiscites. We could be having systematic polls to decide whether tax rates should go up or down, to decide whether the Bank of England should raise or lower interest rates. So we could have much more democracy than we have right now, and yet there's almost no push for that. And I think there's good reasons for that. I think that if we had 10% more democracy, at least in the ways that I'm tending to think of it, most of us would think that would be a lot worse. We could easily be voting for so many more government jobs. We could easily be voting securely on government decisions just as we move our money around electronically. And yet nobody does that. And I think a key reason is because many of us understand that delegating a lot of government decisions to experts, or at least to people who do this as a full-time job for a few years at a time, is a really good idea. The reason why we like representative democracy isn't just because it's physically difficult to have people gather together. Yes, for the ancient Greeks, that was physically hard, so they would delegate some people to make decisions for a year or so. We don't have that problem as much anymore. The reason we like representative democracy, the reason we like an independent judiciary, the reason we like an independent central bank, is because we think it's good to hand over power to some people for a while who just focus on that. It's a version of Adam Smith's division of labor right there, that you have representatives focus on writing legislation and coming up with coalitions with other political leaders to come up with new laws. We have judges who are experts on the law, who have long terms and are kept away from government kept away from the citizens and from democratic appeal to a great degree. And we have central bankers who have very long terms often and are kept almost as far away as possible from the levers of government. So many of us have an intuitive idea that some degree of insider control is highly functional. And I think that intuition is absolutely right. So what I did over the last few years as I wrote my book, I made a point of reviewing the literature on this. So it wasn't just so we can move beyond the debates of Aristotle about the optimal kind of constitution and actually say, what do we know about when elite control works better than mass control? I saw a version of this when I was a United States Senate aide quite a while ago. When one works in the US Senate, where politicians have 6-year terms, everyone notices that when a senator is getting ready for re-election, they start voting a lot differently. When they're freshly elected, they have their grand visions of how they want to change the world. When they get about 2 years out from re-election, they start thinking, what do my voters want back home? They start, so think of this, right? When politicians are doing what we like, we call that being responsive to the will of the people. When politicians are listening to the voters and doing what we don't like, we call that pandering to the voters, right? So we just have different words for whether we like it when we're getting more democracy or not. And I'd like to move beyond that and just say, is actually existing democracy getting us exactly what we want? The pandering of politicians to voters a couple years out just before re-election. Nowadays, we don't have to just tweet about that. We don't have to just talk about it on social media. We can check and see, how do people vote differently just before an election? And so I found that just before an election, politicians are much less likely to vote for free trade agreements. When a democracy gets into a financial crisis and the IMF comes to the country and says, here's a financial aid package we can create for you to try to help you get through this problem, but we'd like some reforms. We'd like some structural reforms. We'd like some, for lack of a better word, neoliberal reforms. Carrot, stick, right? When a financial crisis happens just before an election, the International Monetary Fund, said to be extremely powerful, caves to the will of the voters. So the IMF asks for fewer labor market structural reforms, fewer neoliberal, for lack of a better word, reforms that economists tend to agree are growth producing and perhaps even great for almost all citizens. And the reason why, it's just before an election. If the International Monetary Fund is afraid of imposing good policy because an election is just around the corner, if senators are afraid to vote for good trade policy when an election is just around the corner, maybe that's an argument for having a little bit longer terms, a little bit more distance from the voters. So the version of this that many of us have seen is that where greater distance between voters and policy works well is with central banking. And I'm a monetary economist by training, and we know that one of our mantras is that central banking, government policy, government influence over monetary policy should be left to people like me. Now, of course, that's an obvious self-serving bias, right? Everyone wants to think, well, I think the world would be better if it were run by people like me. But fortunately, we have evidence on this now. Turns out many countries around the world, perhaps most famously New Zealand, have switched from central banks that are very close to the voters to central banks that are very far from the voters. And when we compare central banks that are closely connected to politicians, central banks whose head can be fired immediately by the head of government, to those where the people who run the central bank are have long terms and are told to have an exclusive focus on inflation policy, wow, it looks like we get something like a free lunch. Central banks that are more independent of the voters have lower, more stable inflation and no worse labor market outcomes compared to those that are more democratically controlled. The typical cynical take of independent central banking is that it's a way to help financial elites at the cost of hurting the workers. I think that's great as a chalkboard theory, and we should test chalkboard theories. This chalkboard theory has been tested. It turns out central banking that is kept further away from the voters gets you that low, stable inflation at no cost to the workers. So the idea of a cruel trade-off is a beautiful, elegant theory on the chalkboard. It's time for us to roll the tape and check out the data. When we do check out the data, we find out that the benefits of 10% less democracy are high. The costs appear to be very low, maybe non-existent. Aristotle had a word for the kind of government that we have today. When he looked around the world and saw governments that were a mixture of democracy with oligarchy, he called that polity. It's not politically correct today to say that we have an oligarchy that's in charge of our government. That term has very negative connotations. But we should recognize that in the actual real world, according to the best evidence available, that blend of democracy and oligarchy we live with today, which Aristotle called polity, is what we in our code call representative democracy. And I welcome greater representative democracy.
Apologies for the technical glitch. We are, all of us, pretty classically liberal oriented, right? So we do care about outcomes. And your upward seems very much based on what outcomes does democracy or a more kind of technocratic attitude provide. But I'm wondering whether there is kind of a different angle, a different benefit to democracy, kind of the process that we go through as a society when it comes to decision-making process in general. So is there a rebuttal from your part, Eamonn, that, should we judge the success of democracy purely based on outcomes, or does the process in itself already has some inherent value?
Well, I can see, I take Garrett's point that longer terms are not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that's partly because actually ordinary voters have got better things to do than bone up on technical political issues and vote on everything. Yeah, we could vote on our iPhones and all the rest of it, but we'd get bored after about a day and a half, I think. And he's right. Yes, it's division of labour. Get somebody to do it who knows what they're doing up to a point. They've still got to be under control. And I think to answer your question, I think all political systems need to be judged on what they produce. The Soviet Union was founded on very high ideals of equality and ownership and so on, but it produced only poverty, repression, and mass murder. And democratic systems are generally open, free, and enlightened, and they generally support liberal values. So I think that is a good outcome. It's maybe not perfect, but it's a good outcome. But of course, some people do think that democracy is good in itself, that participation gets people thinking about issues, it boosts people's social awareness, makes the public better informed. And so that has led to calls for greater participation through technical means, through the internet, and in more local decision making, because old style voting is really quite cumbersome and very slow. But I'm not convinced about that. I mean, I think that things like deliberative democracy, where you're trying to involve lots of people, you're having focus groups and citizens juries and all of this, I think probably produces worse outcomes than what we've got at the moment, because interest groups have even more sway than they have at the moment. And I think that's one of our problems in democracy, is that we've got a few people with a very fierce interest in getting things their own way, whereas the rest of the general public are not too concerned, and it doesn't really matter too much for them. So the interest groups have a great deal of pressure. But so that's a downside. But in general, yes, I think I think the outcomes are generally good.
And talking about interest groups, a lot of classical liberals nowadays criticize crony capitalism, and I think quite justly. But Garrett, in your book, you outline an idea, namely that bondholders should have more influence on the government than they currently do. And Eamonn, you mentioned special interests, and I'm wondering whether you're not worried whether these kind of bondholders or special interest group would capture some of the decision-making process. Big corporations are often not very fond of free markets. They're more fond of crony capitalism. So how do you imagine the balancing exercise when it comes to this oligopoly that you outline with your example?
Well, so I do discuss this idea that I think that bondholders are actually shaping our government right now, right? People who hold treasuries, people who hold UK gilts, these folks are actually voting on our governance every day. If they think our long run policy is bad, the prices of these bonds go down. If they think our policy is good, they think the price of these bonds goes up. And if we ever get in a crisis, as the Greeks have learned, if you ever get in a crisis, those bondholders, those people who lend to you, will be getting a big voice in your government someday. And so if they're going to be getting a big voice in your government when a crisis arrives, probably you should start listening to them right now, before the crisis arrives. So I think that bondholders have a long run focus and interest in the long run sustainability and productivity of governments and of countries that citizens and even many elected politicians just don't have. So when we ask who is involved in democratic governance that has a very strong focus in the long run, there are a lot of people who say on Twitter that they have an interest in the long run health and sustainability of rich democracies. But people who've lent for 30 years to these governments, they definitely have skin in the game. And so we should give some voice to people who have skin in the game, a voice, not a veto. I tend to think one particular reason to think about this is that if we think of our lower houses as basically the big voice of democracy, the voice of the people, many countries have some kind of upper house. In the UK, it's the House of Lords. In the US, it's the Senate. And nobody quite knows what to do with these organizations anymore, right? Because they are openly much less democratic than the lower house. And I think that if we think about what we want out of governance, then we will realize that it'd be good to have some other body that is a check on the voice of mass democracy, not a veto. And whether we think of that as something like a House of Lords, whether we think of that as giving bondholders a voice in government, these are ways to have a formal check on the mass influence of voters.
Sounds interesting, although I'm not sure that my colleagues who have recently become members of the House of Lords would very much appreciate being changed with some bondholders. But from an outcome-based perspective, it might provide much better outcomes for us classical liberals. Eamonn, you touched a bit in your introductory notes about on the international angle of spreading democracy and giving 3 cheers for democracy when it comes to places like North Korea, who wish to become more like the United Kingdom or the US. But I'm wondering how context dependent these democratic norms and institutions are. So it has been the idea of the 90s and early 2000s to spread democracy across the world, kind of the idea of nation building. I would claim that it hasn't been a success, or at least not a big enough success to justify it. Do you have any ideas how these democratic norms develop across the world, and us classical liberals based in the West, whether we can help or hinder in any possible way?
Well, I think we should do our very best, but I think that democracy is not something you can simply uproot and plant in new soil and expect it to flourish. To flourish, it needs care and cultivation, and it needs public understanding of what democracy is all about and how it works. And I think democracy doesn't automatically deliver prosperity. Liberal values do, yes, that's right. And often those are associated with democracy. So people often think that, well, let's give them democracy and then they'll be wealthy and as well. That doesn't actually always work. As I say, in the West, we've lived with the institutions of liberal democracy for so long that we just take them for granted. It's it's like a fish swimming in the water doesn't even notice the water, because that's life, and we don't even notice our rights and liberties until we start losing them. And again, countries often adopt the trappings of democracy when it's not the real thing, and you don't have the rule of law. You have corrupt judges, you have limited rights, sham election, religion dominating everything. There may not even be any common feeling of nationhood in a particular territory. There may be ethnic or tribal, cultural, religious conflict, bitterness, feuding, and those sorts of things give voice to people who say, well, we need strong leadership. We don't need democracy. We need strong leadership. But that gets you down another hole. I think you're right that the West has generally failed to create new democracies, partly because they thought it would be just too easy, and partly because they see democracy as a way of driving political reform in places where they haven't reformed for good reason, because there's a lot of deep feeling about certain issues which you're never going to reform. And so often where we have created democracy, and I think the British are guilty of this through many places in Africa that used to be parts of the British Empire, that often we give the impression that democracy is about the majority deciding what should be done, and then they can just ride roughshod over the rest of the community and do what they like. And it's difficult to realize you have to learn that that's not what democracy is about. And even here in sunny Britain, we went through a civil war and many tens of thousands of people dead in order to work out what democracy was all about. So I think it can take centuries, and it's not something you can just uproot and plant in another part of the world until you address all of those background issues.
Mm. And as a continental European, I cannot avoid asking the question when it comes to the European Union. This has been the big dividing topic of many classical liberals in the last couple of decades. In the UK, it seems to be resolved now. On the rest of the continent, not necessarily. Garrett, you take the example of the EU and especially the European Commission in your book as the kind of template for technocracy. And you claim that it provides more often than not superior political outcomes than many of the more democratic national governments do. I'm wondering whether you still believe that to be the case. And I'm wondering whether the European Union and all the processes within the EU that are trying to make it more democratic would actually benefit or hinder our kind of classical liberal goals when it comes to shaping the future of the EU with a classical liberal angle.
Well, the EU is a hard case. That's actually the title of my chapter on the European Union, the hard case of the European Union. And, it is difficult, right? But the EU is facing a difficult problem structurally. And so the big thing that I came to as I thought more about my views on the EU is that the EU faces far more political diversity across its regions than, say, even the UK has within itself, right? And that's a lot of diversity right there. So any political organization that has an incredibly diverse group of political backgrounds of its members is going to have difficulty coming to an agreement. So, and the way that shows up constitutionally is that an organization where the members have very diverse views coming in will tend to insist on something like supermajority rule, right? If you're thinking of joining an organization where basically everybody agrees with you, you say, well, let's just use majority rule. We'll just work it out in post-production, as they say in the movies, right? But if everybody holds very different views, you're really concerned when you enter this organization whether you're going to be stuck getting a bad deal. In settings like that, people will only join something like the European Union if there's something like unanimity rule, supermajority rule, what Americans call the filibuster, right? And indeed, that's just what we've seen. So I tend to think that the biggest problems that the European Union faces in governance aren't problems of technocracy. Its technocracy works pretty well for the median country. It works pretty well for the median citizen. The problems that the European Union faces are problems of democracy and what kind of democracy you can have when Europe and its citizens disagree with each other on so much. So the supermajority requirements, the unanimity requirements, these are problems of democracy. And it's okay for a democracy to have supermajority rule. Indeed, as my colleagues Buchanan and Tulloch pointed out long ago, the ethical ideal for democracy shouldn't start with majority rule. It should start with unanimity rule and walk back from that only reluctantly, right? The way you can make sure nobody gets hurt by a system is to make sure everybody has to agree with each decision of the system. So supermajority requirements, totally democratic. And so I see the problems of the EU as primarily supermajority, driven by the natural outcome of many diverse nations trying to come to some kind of union. It's not a natural union, right? These folks that are so different. I'm glad it's been as successful as it has, but you would expect that a place like the UK, which is much economically freer than the median EU country, has less to gain from a situation like that. So I don't have any particular beef for or against Brexit, but I would point out that the very freest countries, those with the most economic, political freedom, have the least to gain from being members of the European Union.
Sure, that makes sense. And I assume, based on the current discussions in the EU bubble about reforming in a more kind of majority and democratic way, you might change your opinion in 5-10 years' time if the supermajority rule disappears, because yes, you outlined that's one of the key advantages of working together. I'm conscious that we have loads of questions flowing in on the Q&A section already. If you haven't asked any questions, feel free to do so, but I'm going to turn to our audience in just a second and start with Victoria Houston, who is asking about the scope of democracy that Eamonn already mentioned. So her question is part of the reason for the tension between technocracy and democracy the fact that governments today intervene so much in private lives and markets? So Eamonn, what's your take on this?
Well, undoubtedly. I mean, I think a lot of the rejection of standard political parties, for example, and people going to extreme parties, is because they do think that government is just too big. It's too intrusive into their lives. So absolutely right. I don't favor a technocratic alternative to that. What I think I would favor, and going back to the EU question, if it's easy to leave, if a country can leave a union, or if an individual can leave a country, then they can just go somewhere else, and they can choose the system of governments that's best for themselves. But I do think that we have a situation where people are very tired of politicians because the news is just dominated by political disputes and discussions. And I think there's more to life than that. Ordinary voters have got better things to do, like fixing their motorbike or cooking a pie, rather than listening to politics and feeling that they ought to know about all of these issues all the time. So yeah, I think that's a lot to do with it.
And you mentioned it's possible to leave democracies. Well, maybe not at the moment during COVID restrictions, but under normal times. But that's quite a, difficult personal decision to make. So besides leaving, what are the other ways for us classical liberals to basically reduce the scope of the power when it comes to the government and make sure that we do have some technocratic decisions, we do have some democratic decisions, but in general, how do we achieve that not everything in life gets decided by democratic votes or by technocratic bureaucrats somewhere in Westminster or in Brussels?
Well, I wish I knew. I think we just have to we have to be clear about our liberal vision, and we have to express that in ways which are attractive. And I think that's really the only way to do it. And you have to work through the existing system. I'm not in favour of liberals holding demonstrastrations in the middle of Oxford Circus and bringing the centre of London to a halt or anything like that. I think that, if you're going on the streets, I think you've lost the argument. And I think you've got to work through the power of ideas. And it is things like think tanks, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, which change the mood of the nation, that they develop ideas and they explain them to people, particularly to young people, and people get captivated by these ideas and they think, hey, this is a lot better than what we've got. So I think you have to work through public debate. I think that's the only way to do it. And that was one of the reasons why Hayek was so influential in starting the IEA. He wanted something which would work not through politics, but through the power of ideas.
So more engagement and more ideas, sure. And we touched upon COVID just for a sec, and Kevin Wilson asks, do you think that democracy has taken a backseat forever because of the use of emergency lockdown legislation? So in the United States, the situation looks a bit better than in the UK. Garrett, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that the lockdown restrictions have been abundantly democratic. I think that politicians who impose in many parts of the United States and in the federal government, politicians who imposed a lot of lockdown restrictions have been extremely popular. So I think the masses have been quite approving. In some states in the US where they're not as popular, those politicians have been quite responsive. So I think we've seen a sort of with just a lag of a few months, we've seen a lot of democratic responsiveness on COVID policy, just as with a lag of a few months, European Union officials were very responsive to the refugee crisis of 2015. So democracy is a little bit slow to listen to the voters sometimes in a crisis, but I think we should notice the restrictions we've seen are restrictions that the massive voters are approving of, and that where probably very few politicians are going to get voted out of office for imposing these restrictions.
Eamonn, do you agree?
Well, yeah, so that's not necessarily a good thing. The majority are in favor of all sorts of illiberal things, which we don't want. I mean, I think in terms of COVID and so on, you have to have a clear idea about what an emergency is. And an emergency is something which is, it's unexpected, but it also is something which is temporary. And I think that, yes, you're right. The general public will allow you to do some pretty radical things in their names during an emergency. But I think you and they have to be clear that an emergency doesn't go on forever. And so when things do change, then you have to change your policy and make sure that you don't just routinely go back to that because you happen to have that legislation on the books. And that's that I think is the biggest danger, that governments like ours have taken themselves enormous powers, or we've discovered they had enormous powers, and those are powers which can be used again not in good ways, in ways in which they were never meant to be used. And that is the problem with democracy, is giving people power that they then use in ways that you hadn't foreseen and you don't like very much.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of work on that front in ensuring that a lot of these temporary decisions and powers remain temporary and disappear once the pandemic is gone. Eamonn, there is another question for you from Linda Whetstone, who says, Eamonn, you said that democracy protects private property, yet the controls imposed by local councils on planning, building, land use, etc., seem to increasingly erode an individual's control over their property in the UK. So I guess the question is, what happens when democracy and other important values are in contrast to one another?
Well, I think Linda's got me on that one, but I think it just it goes to show what I said at the very beginning, that democracy has to be limited, and it has to respect our liberal values, like private property, for example, rather than abusing them. And you can certainly argue that, well, there are many things in terms of land use that have spillover effects with other people, and therefore these should be subject to some kind of government or regulatory limits. But certainly in our post-war planning act, which is still really enforced today, it's just gone to excess, and you have very little control over your own property at all, and the planners can take it from you and all sorts of things. Now, to me, that's clearly an abuse of democracy. That is one of those instances, and there were many in the post-war years, where democracy went too far, in that our representatives felt that they had the power to take decisions over subjects which they should not rightly have power over in a democratic system.
And there's kind of a question related to the threats to democracy, which I would like to link to a question how we would need to shape institutions in the West when it comes to enabling democracy, but also improving outcomes. So the question says, what do you consider the biggest threat to democracy today? And after answering that, I would also be keen to hear your thoughts on what is the future of democratic institutions in the West, how we can ensure that these threats do not realize. Garrett?
Well, I think there really aren't that many threats to what we think of as representative democracy. I think that for the foreseeable future, it'll be very common to have mass political participation, competitive parties, reasonably fair counting of votes across the rich countries. To that extent, I think Fukuyama has been right. The end of history is something like liberal democracy, and for at least most of the richest countries, the vast majority of them. So the question going forward is, how much do we get the liberal and how much do we get the democracy? And, you know, like many of you, I'm looking forward to ways to improve governance so that we get a more robust version of that liberal side of liberal democracy. The biggest threats, I think, are to liberalism more than to democracy per se. There are always forces pushing for stasis. There are forces pushing against economic dynamism, and there are a lot of forces pushing for, you know, the status quo. That's, I think, of the bigger threat going forward than threats to actual mass participation in government.
Eamonn, do you agree that the threat is the disappearance of liberalism, not necessarily democracy?
That is another problem, I think. Yes, absolutely. But what I would say is, I think that the biggest threat to democracy is our over-reliance on it. The fact that we do get dewy-eyed about it and think that it's wonderful, and then we start applying it to lots of other things. And to some extent, and I speak as the great nephew of a leading suffragette, to some extent, it's the expansion of the franchise has made majority rule look more legitimate, when it was only a few men of property were voting on things. I think they understood that that their powers were necessarily limited because they didn't really have legitimacy. And it's, I suppose, to some extent the same with our House of Lords at the moment. They're not elected, and therefore they're conscious of the limits of their power. But when you've got everybody voting for a government, then the government thinks, oh, I've got the mandate, we've got the mandate of the people. We can do whatever we like. Well, no, you can't do whatever you like. Democracy isn't a system in which you do whatever you like, whatever the majority dictates. That's not what it's about. It's to serve our values, not to superimpose them. So I think that we do need to make sure that democracy is focused on its core purposes, to preserve individual rights, minimize coercion, reduce conflict, and decide the few things that we can only decide collectively. Most things we can decide ourselves. And I think we need to emphasize the need for those minima and minimum institutions, binding rules to curb the power of majorities, curb the power of voters, curb the power of politicians, and to have free and fair and competitive elections, and a firm protection of civil liberties, free speech, and a free press, as well as, I think, boosting civil society and spontaneous order. So, let's give a cheer to local organizations rather than to political ones.
And when it comes to politics, I often hear pundits and politicians complain that turnouts at elections are very low. People are not engaged with our democratic process enough. And we have a question related to that, namely, what do you think about compulsory voting in democracies? The famous economist Dambisa Moyo mentioned compulsory voting in her book, The Edge of Chaos, as one of the 10 reforms for her blueprint for a new democracy. Do you think that such a policy would not be authoritarian? Can you give us some feedback on examples? I know that I think in Italy, compulsory voting has been introduced, but no one really checks it. So what are your thoughts on compulsory voting? Would we have better, more classical liberal outcomes or not?
Who do you want, me or Garrett?
Eamonn, you can start. And
okay, well, yeah, there are many places where we have compulsory voting, like Australia. And it's, voting day is a great day, and everybody gets together and throws some prawns on the barbie, and then they all go down to the voting booth, and it's great fun. I'm certainly I'm against forcing people to do anything they don't want to do. And many people, I think, don't necessarily want to vote. They've got other things to do. But what I do think is that it doesn't seem to make much difference to the outcomes. So why do it? And also, I think it again further legitimizes a process which is not always legitimate. Again, a government can say, well, the whole country voted for us, well, no, not necessarily. Many of them might have voted against. Many of them might have resented the fact that they were expected to vote at all because they just disapprove of the entire system. So I think I'm against universal voting because I think it just legitimizes the political process.
Garrett, do you agree with this?
I agree. I don't think people should be having to face a tax if they're unable to vote on election day. I think making voting easy is valuable. Finding ways to actually move toward, smartphone voting is valuable. So that people can. So we know that the governments will listen to everyone as much as possible. But taxing people if they don't vote, imposing fines, is a step in the wrong direction. And I think the evidence shows it's not going to really change the nature of government in any case. Our modern governments have a very broad franchise and do make it relatively easy to vote. And it's clear that the voices of different sections of the population really do get a voice within modern representative democracy. So I do think that the greater focus should be on how we get good outcomes out of these representative democracies than tinkering with the franchise slightly this way or that.
So we have unanimity against compulsory voting, no debate there. Another angle that was often discussed in the last couple of years when it comes to democracy is the uprising or the rise of populism across Europe and partially in the United States as well. So Christopher Marshall asks a question about that, and he wrote, the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump were both dismissed as examples of populism. What is populism, and is it a threat to democracy? I think that could justify another hour-long conversation. But Eamonn, do you have a quick definition of democracy and populism for us? And is populism actually part of democracy, or rather a threat to it?
Well, my idea of democracy is something which is constitutionally limited, that there are limits on what it can do and to whom it can do it, and to what degree it can do it. And populism is more of the thought that the majority should basically decide what should be done. So if the majority decide that everybody who wears purple socks should be executed, that's what happens. That to me is populism. And I think to some extent we have already slipped towards that. I think we've already slipped into a system where our politicians are no longer limited by the common rules of the democratic process, but they do think, yes, they have the power to legislate in any way they like for the whole country, and that's populism, and I'm against it.
And I guess the opposite of populism would be if we would further limit the powers of individuals in enabling to influence other people's lives. And David Harold Chester is asking a question that reads, with the limited public interest in democratic decision-making, would it not be useful to limit voters in referenda to a few specialized subject matters, so only a few experts can express their views? So I guess math professors would be voting on economic matters, doctors would be voting about health policy. What do you think about that? Would that be the kind of technocratic expertise that you support, Garrett? Or is that completely, wrong way to approach it?
Well, without knowing the precise details of that proposal, I mean, I can say that's the way central banks are pretty much run now, right? Some of the world's top economists get together with a few other folks and decide how monetary policy is going to work, how banking is going to work. And that seems to work fairly well. And part of the reason it works is because these folks are kept at distance from the voters. But part of the reason it probably works is because the voters can check in now and then. So I like to say that populism is the kind of democracy you don't like personally. And but William Riker, the late political scientist, put it much better. The title of his book was Liberalism Against Populism. So populism is a kind of, if we think of it as loose majority rule that's willing to exploit the minority, that is one version of democracy. And it's one we should try to avoid. But liberalism combined with democracy, I think it's that egalitarian norm, that respect for everyone's individual rights that a lot of us value. So liberalism and populism are in natural tension. When we use the word liberal democracy, we're almost assuming the answer that at some point we can get the best of both worlds. Some of the rich countries have been able to pull that off, and I hope more countries around the world can get that right balance of liberalism with mass voter participation.
Eamonn, what do you think would happen if only doctors were allowed to vote about NHS reform?
Well, this is what has happened already, and it's bad. You've had what we call SAGE, our advisory group on emergencies, dominated by medics, and of course, in the COVID situation, their advice is close everything down, shut everything down, kill the virus. They haven't taken into account all of the costs of doing that, the economic costs and the psychological costs and the social costs. So I think technocratic solutions like central banks are fine, provided you've got a fairly widespread agreed target, and that it's a simple target. And in the case of central banking, it's preserving the value of the currency. It's a pretty simple thing or a simple target, not a simple thing to do, but a simple target to appreciate. Whereas in running a country, you've got all sorts of different interests pulling you in different directions, and judging what you should do with all of those pressures on you, I think is a much more delicate task. And I'm not sure that even Einstein could navigate your way through that lot.
I have left probably the most difficult question for you to the end, and we only have a couple of seconds left. So if you could keep your answers short. The question is, will China ever be democratic? I guess the question means liberal democratic. So Garrett, what's your prediction on this?
No, not in the next 50 years. I think that the Communist Party has decided that keeping their oligarchy in charge is much better than mass voter participation from their own point of view. It's a safer option. And they don't want to go down the path of Russia, where they saw how a change from democracy from their oligarchy to something much more like liberal democracy led to the insiders losing. Insiders protect themselves. The Chinese Communist Party has that power to protect themselves. I think that's what we'll see for the next 2 generations.
I agree on that, but with the proviso that as people get richer, they actually demand more say over their affairs.
That is the tension. Yes. Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed every minute of this discussion. I'm a huge fan of political theory, so I could listen to you for another hour, but my colleagues are ringing the bell that we must come to an end. So just as a reminder to our audience that Eamonn's Democracy Primer is now out and available on our website at no additional cost to you. And Garett's recent book, 10% Less Democracy, is also available on Amazon. I only have it on my Kindle, so I don't have the nice cover, but Garett does. And it's only thanks to our generous donors that we're able to provide our primers for free to our global audience and organize these events. So thank you so much for your support. And if you would like to receive a copy of Eamonn's new book, then please do message my colleagues at bookclub@iea.org.uk. And if you're not yet a book club member, but you wish to become one, then your support would mean a lot to us. And it would mean that we can continue to invite world-class scholars like Garett and publish these materials by Eamonn for free across the globe. And if you are a regular follower of IEA book clubs, then the next event will be with Tom Shivers on his latest book called How to Read Numbers, A Guide to Statistics in the News. And this will take place on the 6th of May, and details will be sent to all book club members very soon. And finally, up next in the Eyes in Conversation series, we will be hosting Liam Fox MP on the 24th of May, and the IEA's Director General, Mark Littlewood, will be chairing this event, so do make sure to tune in. And if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London, and make sure to hit the bell icon so you get notified whenever we go live. And of course, do visit our website, iea.org.uk, where you can find out a lot about upcoming events, research papers, and of course, keep us going by providing us with a contribution, a donation, no matter how modest, which would be a huge help and deeply appreciated by all of us at the Institute. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you have a very lovely rest of the afternoon.